Tonight on PrimeTime Politics, a new pledge to ramp up defense spending.
Our fundamental goal in all of this is to protect Canadians, not to satisfy NATO accountants.
Still, the Prime Minister says Canada will hit NATO's target this year. Is it doable, and is it enough to satisfy Canadian allies? We'll have opposition reaction from Conservative defense critic James Bezan. Plus, we break down the numbers with defense expert David Perry. Also tonight, the government promises a big economic boost with its One Canadian Economy bill. We take a closer look at internal trade and big national projects with economist Pedro Antunes. This is PrimeTime Politics. Hello, I'm Andrew Thompson with you tonight. Michael Serapio is on assignment. Canada is moving up its plan to boost defense spending. The government is now pledging to hit NATO's 2% GDP target this fiscal year instead of by 2030. Defense-related spending is now set to rise by more than $9 billion this year to nearly $63 billion. How will the government make it happen? The plan includes better pay and health care for those in uniform, more spending on aircraft, ammunition, and armed vehicles, more radar, drones, and sensors, more Coast Guard funding, and boosting Canada's defense industry. The Prime Minister is saying today that Canada has been too reliant on the United States and spending has failed to keep up with global risks.
A new imperialism threatens. Middle powers must compete for interests and attention, knowing that if they're not at the table, they're on the menu. Indeed, the threats that Canada faces are multiplying. Our plan will help ensure that Canada is strong at home and reliable abroad. We will ensure that every dollar is invested wisely, including by prioritizing made-in-Canada manufacturing and supply chains. We should no longer send 3/4 of our defense capital spending to America.
All right, well, let's get a response from the official opposition. James Bezan is the Conservative Shadow Minister for National Defence, joining me from Parliament Hill. And we should say that we did reach out to the government. The Liberals were not able to provide someone today for a panel, but we will speak with Mr. Bezan about the Conservative view. Now, the government is promising $9 billion in new spending to reach that 2% NATO target this year instead of several years down the road. Will your party be supporting that funding when it comes to a vote as supplementary estimates?
Well, first of all, we do support increasing defense spending to meet the NATO commitment of 2%. We campaigned on that, and we do support getting there faster and getting there this year, knowing that the world is a much more dangerous place. You know, Pierre Poilievre has been very clear that Canada has to take care of ourselves. We can't be dependent upon our allies anymore. That means that we have to make the investments in our troops, in our equipment, and making sure that we can protect our sovereignty, especially in the Arctic. So we're calling on the government to buy the things that we need as quickly as possible, but we need to know the plan on how to get there, and we do expect a budget to support this operational spending. We know that the $9 billion more spending that was announced in the National Defence plans that came out in the supplementary estimates this morning. However, it's still short of where 2% is, and so we need to know where that other money is coming from and how much more other departments are also going to increase. So, you know, there's a lot of questions that we have here that we're going to have for the minister and the government as we go forward, and the best way that they can answer this is actually present a budget and we'll try to get it out of here before Canada Day so that Canadians know how the government's going to spend this money that is coming from the taxpayers of Canada.
Okay, given what you have seen, though, of that $9 billion plan, the government did break it down into categories. As you look at the details to date, do you think it is something that your party can get behind?
Yeah, so we are supporting this. I think that the question becomes in how they present it in the House. You know, normally on most of the supplementary estimates, the official opposition opposes. So if this is done in a vote line by department, you know, I would think that we would be supportive, but there's still a lot of details that have to be fleshed out. including how the Canadian Coast Guard is going to be absorbed into national defence. You're talking about a civilian organization that has no mandate at this current time on national security, including border patrol and protection. So are they going to be arming up our Coast Guard vessels? Are they going to be putting troops on board, or are they going to be training up some of the civilians who serve on our Coast Guard vessels as paramilitary members? And or the other question around it is what happens with the rest of the Coast Guard mandate that has nothing to do with national defense, such as fisheries monitoring, their ice breaking in our commercial channels like the St. Lawrence Seaway, and also what are they doing with the environmental program that so often referred to as one of the best in Canada, if not the world, that the Coast Guard undertakes on behalf of scientists from across the country.
I do want to ask you about procurement as well. That was part of the announcement, a promise to move forward on a new defense procurement agency, because we've heard for years about this being an issue. You know that well, given your experience on the national defense file. Did you hear anything today from the government that gives you optimism that we're going to be moving ahead on a faster timeline with actually seeing the government spend money without having funding lapse or seeing delays in these projects?
Well, they are talking about bringing forward a defense procurement agency. They've talked about this in the past. It was in the 2019 campaign. We studied this at the National Defence Committee back in the 2015 time frame of Parliament. And what it comes down to is that we need some actual leadership on this. We need to get the money out the door. The Department of both National Defence and Public Works and Procurement Canada have been very slow on making decisions when it comes to major procurements. So like right now, Prime Minister Carty's got us doing a review of the F-35. That's just, again, potentially slowing down the replacement of the fighter jets that our Royal Canadian Air Force desperately needs. So we want that review done as quickly as possible so we can get the jets that our Air Force wants. So, procurement is a difficult file. So we want to know if they're going to be doing this faster, how are they going to do this to respect the current procurement rules and regulations that we have as defined underneath the Treasury Board, and ultimately ensure that the Canadian defence industry is able to benefit from it, and ultimately where we can't produce it here domestically, if they're going to be buying it off the shelf from other countries.
Okay, in the time we have left, I want to talk about the NATO commitment and the NATO targets, because during the campaign, Conservatives, your party, and Liberals talked about reaching that number by 2030. Now, NATO Secretary General says if we think we can keep ourselves safe sticking with the 2%, forget it. And we've now got this new idea of a 5% level of defense spending, including core spending and defense-related infrastructure. Where do you think that leaves Canada?
Well, first of all, NATO needs to come to a consensus, and you can't just arbitrarily set a number and have all member states reach that goal. So I think that we've got to make sure that there's going to be consensus from all member states that this is how they want to go. For most of the countries, including Canada, just going from 2% to 3.5%, which would be the core funding, is a big leap. And then in Canada, the other funding into infrastructure becomes a little more convoluted, because they also have to work alongside the provinces and territories who are responsible for a lot of that infrastructure, whether it's highways, train, rail, as well as ports, and how that is done in a way that is acceptable under the NATO guideline. So, there's a lot of questions that need to be asked, but we're willing to look at it. We want to know how we can do more to support the Canadian Armed Forces, protect our sovereignty, and ensure that Canada is safe from the excursions that we're witnessing in our Arctic from Russia, from China, and others that have other alternative motives for traversing through our Arctic waters. Okay,
let's finish on this then. Let's stay on the international front. And in the context of today's announcement, this extra $9 billion, the plan to reach the 2%, how do you expect Canada's allies are going to react to this? How do you expect the United States is going to react to this? Does this put Canada in a better place as we head to the G7, as we head to the NATO Leaders Summit?
Well, as you know, that the 2% was originally agreed to by Stephen Harper back in 2015. Of course, we didn't form government at the end of 2015. It was then Justin Trudeau Liberal government. And for 10 years, the Liberals sat on their hands and barely moved the dial on defence spending. Actually, the increase in spending that we've witnessed over the last decade has come through new accounting measures by adding in other departments, like part of the Coast Guard in the past, as well as veterans' pensions and Global Affairs Canada budgets that deal with conflict resolution. So that type of creative accounting increased the Liberal spending a bit, but not actually a whole lot for the Department of National Defence. So I think that, most of our allies would be sitting back and going, well, it's about time, but at the end of the day, we want to make sure that Canada is that reliable partner, and Conservatives believe that we have to be in NATO as well as under NORAD, and protect our own backyard first. And then at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we're not just spending money willy-nilly. We have to make sure we're investing in the capabilities and capacity that's required by the Canadian Armed Forces, including fixing the recruitment crisis that has currently been going on for far too long over the last 5 years, so we can get up to full troop strength and be able to deal with the equipment that is aged out on us, and right now is only about half of it is serviceable and able to be used by our forces.
All right, James Bezan, Conservative Shadow Minister for Defence, thanks for joining me and offering the opposition view on all this.
I'm glad to join you. Thank you so much.
Well, as you heard a moment ago in that conversation, the Canadian promise to spend more on defence comes with the head of NATO talking about a new target. That's 5% of GDP, with 3.5% on core defence spending, the rest on infrastructure and related items. Here's Secretary General Mark Rutte.
5% is not some figure plucked from the air. It's grounded in hard facts. The exact details are classified. But we need a 400% increase in air and missile defense. We see in Ukraine how Russia delivers terror from above. So we will strengthen the shield that protects our skies. It is clear, if we do not invest more, our collective defense is not credible. Spending more is not about pleasing an audience of one. It is about protecting 1 billion people.
Well, for more on NATO targets and Canada's spending plans, let's bring in David Perry, President and CEO of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, someone who studies defence matters very closely, especially on the financial side. Dave, good to see you. I want to start with what you make of the numbers you're reading today as you go through this plan, the $9 billion for this fiscal year.
I think the big takeaway is that add it all up, they should come at least pretty close to us hitting our 2% of GDP mark, the NATO investment pledge we committed to back in 2014 that we haven't been meeting since that time. So this is a pretty important step to see the Prime Minister take, both making the announcement and giving a quite good speech, which I think hit a lot of the right notes, and then actually coming forward with the money the same day, which hasn't been something we've tended to see in the past.
Well, I want to ask you about the actual spending of that money and whether this is a feasible plan, because, we've often talked about, can the government actually spend the money it sets aside for defense, whether it's issues with procurement, delays, lapsed spending. Do you see anything different with this announcement that gives you some optimism that this time the ball will actually be rolling?
So both good and bad. The bad is that the announcement's being made basically 3 months already into the fiscal year. This is actually the time of the year when the departments start to actually try and figure out what they think they won't spend by the end of the following March. So it's an announcement that's coming well into the planning cycle for the federal government. So actually moving this forward is going to be kind of tricky from that point of view, just in terms of where we are in the annual financial cycle. I think the good thing is that, as Lisa was explained in some briefings this afternoon, the Department of Defense is focused on a bunch of more executable spending areas than I think might have otherwise been the case, and is usually the case with new announcements. So there's a little bit of money for capital investment, but mostly to top up project budgets that don't have enough, to add additional quantities onto existing orders. The other funding, though, is for improving readiness, so tagging extra money onto the spending we do on maintenance and repair, providing some extra funds for a couple different aspects of personnel. I think probably the biggest chunk of that is going to be a pay raise for the troops, which is a relatively straightforward exercise to get approved, and then you can make it retroactive if you want to. And then some of the other pieces, making investments in the defense industry. There's been a couple of different initiatives that have been chugging along, but not actually actioned yet. Didn't see the detail today, but there's some existing production mechanisms that could be pulled pretty easily, like extra ammunition purchases, extra light armored vehicle purchases, as an example. And then the last chunk they talked about was a partnership. And I think with all of the different signaling that's come from the Prime Minister specifically, as well as other members of the cabinet, I am guessing that funding, or at least a good chunk of it, is going to be for Canadian participation in the Rearm Europe program.
Right. As you say, a lot of breadth to what the government was announcing today, between boosting salaries, spending more, spending to boost the defense sector and those international partnerships. Was there anything missing in this announcement today that strikes you as significant?
I think in terms of an end-year announcement, not really. I think the big thing will be, and that actually wasn't part announced by the Prime Minister, that they're going to do another defense policy. The ink's only been dry on the last one for a little over a year, but I would presume that that new policy would work within a resource envelope that starts at 2% of GDP being committed as a minimum and looks upward from there. One of the big constraints we've had in past defense policies is trying to figure out exactly how much money the Department of National Defense could entice or convince the politicians to start spending, and then working back from there. This is a bit of a different dynamic where you've actually got a relatively stable start point at 2%, which is a completely different funding environment for the armed forces to work with as they craft the new policy. So I think the forward-looking piece is the one thing that there wasn't much detail on today.
Okay, well, I want to, in the time we have left, talk about NATO, which is where that 2% target came from. Now, the Prime Minister said the fundamental goal is to protect Canadians and not to satisfy NATO accountants. But the pressure from NATO and allies is only going to get bigger, because we are hearing that new figure of 5% of GDP as a spending target when NATO leaders meet later last month. Where do you think that leaves Canada?
In a better place than we were before this morning. Can't get to any higher target, 3.5%, 5%, until you get to 2 first. And we were we were one of only 3 countries on the last report to come out of the alliance that looked at spending across both the 2% investment target as well as the other target we have of spending 20% of what we do spend on defense to go towards expenditures on equipment and research and development. We were one of only 3 allies meeting neither of these targets, which did not put us in good standing with our alliance counterparts. The Prime Minister made a comment today about not being too concerned about NATO accountants. I think he is concerned about how the other NATO heads of state look at Canada, or at least the heads of government look at Canada. And I think he took a good step forward today to trying to restore some of the Canadian credibility that has really, I think, eroded in the last decade, as we have not met the commitments we signed up to in 2014, and until today didn't actually have a plan to actually get there.
Yeah, and one of those NATO heads of state is, of course, Donald Trump. So I want to close with you on a question about the United States and how you think this announcement today is connected to these Canadian negotiations with the U.S. on security and trade, and what we've been hearing from American leaders about Canada's defense capacity.
I mean, I think given the importance of the United States, the Canadian relationships of a whole bunch of different kinds, economic, defense, and security, that this is going to be subtext for all of those negotiations. I think this commitment today, the funding of it, puts the Prime Minister and puts Canada in a much stronger position in those discussions with the United States, because our underinvestment in defense has been a chronic irritant in the Canada-U.S. relationships, not just a feature of the discussions with President Trump. Those have just been a little bit more pointed in public. It's been a lingering irritant over successive American administrations. So this is a big step forward to taking that off the table. Now we're going to have to talk about the future and getting beyond where we are today to a new investment pledge target. But this is certainly a very important, overdue step in the right direction.
Okay, David Perry, thanks for your time on this. Always good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Now to Bill C-5. That's the government's plan for boosting Canada's economy through internal trade and faster approval of big national projects. Today, ministers are facing more questions on resistance to the bill.
There is no way in God's green earth that Bill C-5 is ready for passage. Concerns and alarms have been raised by every environmental law association in Canada, by the Climate Action Group, by now the Grand Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, and the Canadian Cancer Society has pointed out that the interprovincial barriers that may come down may lead to a race to the bottom on health and environmental risks. Please, will the government redraft and reintroduce a bill that has a hope of passage?
I'm really glad that she raised the issue of interprovincial barriers to trade. The fact is that today we effectively impose a 7% tariff on each other. Canadians imposing a tariff on Canadians with these interprovincial barriers to trade. Now is the moment when Canadians understand we need to stop doing this. We need to knit our country more closely together. We need to build the strongest economy in the G7.
And with me now is Pedro Antunes, Chief Economist at the Conference Board of Canada. Pedro, always good to see you here in studio.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
So, Bill C-5. The Prime Minister often says, you know, Canadians, we can give ourselves more than Americans can take away. But is eliminating trade barriers a key part of Bill C-5? Is it really enough to counteract the effect of all these tariffs we're seeing? I mean, we have seen that number of $200 billion in lost economic opportunity. How do you see it?
I certainly agree that it's about time. Shame on us for not having an open market for all these years. It's a topic that we've been pushing for and talking about, you know, across the research agenda and from a policy perspective. This is a long time coming. But can it really counter what's happening right now with tariffs and our trade war? I think there's, you know, an issue of time to get those benefits. So even as we start to remove those trade barriers, how does that all work? Well, it essentially makes opens the market. It makes you know, some firms less competitive, others more competitive. It allows firms to grow, and that's how that is going to evolve. In essence, to bring about, you know, more competition, cheaper prices, and essentially a stronger economy. But it does take time. The impacts we're feeling from tariffs, it's, you know, it's immediate. It's going to hurt right now. We're seeing job losses in manufacturing. We have yet to see the impacts of these higher tariffs now on steel and aluminum. You know, we can't really counter that very quickly with internal trade barriers, but it's not to say that we shouldn't forge ahead as hard as possible on that topic.
Yeah, and there does seem to be, at least on that part of the bill, a fair bit of political consensus. Maybe a little bit less consensus on the other part of Bill C-5, which deals with reviewing major projects, getting those projects of national interest built faster. He did have the premiers convened with the Prime Minister to talk about these nation-building projects. But of course, you need the private sector for those. Is there enough stability in our economy right now? You just talked about everything that's happening in terms of the effect of tariffs. Is there enough stability in our economy where the private sector can actually take on a lot of these big nation-building projects?
Well, I think that's definitely going to be a challenge, and we can look at the example of residential construction, for example. Over the last few years, we've been, certainly in 23, 24, just the last 2 years really, we've been trying to make a lot of effort, throwing a lot of money at residential construction, and we've seen a steep decline in productivity. In other words, we're trying to push a sector that is supply constrained. We don't have the workers to be able to produce all the housing that we're trying to get. So I think this is a similar issue. We have to be very conscious of what we have in terms of especially skilled labor in the trades. If we're talking about major construction projects, we need to be aware of timing and, you know, do we have the workforce? And again, that goes back to unifying the market across Canada. We need a unified market, not just in terms of goods, but also in terms of mobility of labor. Really, really important if we want to achieve that growth.
Yeah, and when it comes to construction and other sectors, I guess, you know, a follow-up question I'm thinking as you talk is just how risk averse is corporate Canada right now? Is the private sector when it comes to funding these projects, given all of the uncertainty that you're talking about?
Major challenges there. One is, you know, our competitiveness at attracting private investment to begin with vis-a-vis the U.S. But I think more important, if you look at really what drives investment, it's the economy. And, you know, the state of the economy right now, I would argue both in the U.S. and in Canada, is not looking very good. just take a look at some of the results we've seen. CEO confidence south of the border has been terrible. We have our own indicator of business confidence. It's rock bottom levels. So I think it's a challenging environment to bring investment forward, but it doesn't impede these major projects from approving these major projects and getting them going. It doesn't impede that, but it may be a challenge in other areas, certainly.
Yeah, now Bill C-5, it also has this streamlined process for approvals. So would that create a more positive impact for the private sector, maybe offset some of that risk, some of that uncertainty?
Well, this again goes to competitiveness with other jurisdictions. So we know that in Canada it takes years to get projects going. I mean, we've seen some terrible examples. We can talk about the TMX, for example, how long it took to get that approved and going. That doesn't show well on the world stage for attracting investment. So this is definitely something we need to do. One project, one approval. Streamlining that approval process will be really important. Whether or not we can do it, I think we still have to see, because in the discussion that we heard from Prime Minister Carney was, yes, we're streamlining, we're giving the cabinet a lot of powers with this, but we need approval from the provinces, from First Nations. That's obviously that's an important piece of our nation building, but we need to figure this out to be able to make those projects, really approve them really quickly.
Right. Okay, we have about 60 seconds left. I want to finish with you on the fiscal side for the government and the potential federal role in some of these projects, because we aren't seeing a budget until the fall. We just had a big announcement today on defense spending, several $billion. Right now, do you see the federal government having the fiscal capacity to get involved in some of these projects, given that we're not seeing a lot of growth in the economy, given that we're seeing a lot of pressure to spend on defense, on housing, on a lot of these other big factors?
Yeah, well, you're right. We haven't seen the budget. So, and I, granted, it's, a new prime minister. We've gone, we want to allow some time to plan and plan properly. But on the other hand, we really can't judge where the money is coming from for these projects. Just on defense, as you mentioned, we heard today, and on infrastructure. We are in a really good fiscal situation relative to the U.S. And relative to many other developed economies, Europe and et cetera. But we don't want to muck that up in any way. So we're running deficits that are 1 or 2% of GDP. Let's not get ourselves into a situation where the U.S. is at with deficits 6 or 7% of GDP.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Pedro Antunes, always great to have your insight. We could talk for a lot longer, but we only had a few moments. Thanks for this.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that is Primetime Politics for Monday, June 9th. I'm Andrew Thompson in Ottawa. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.